Welcome to the C.S. Lewis Festival Scholar Series. I'm your host, David Crouse. Today's final episode is a Zoom interview I had with renowned Lewis scholar, author, and professor, Dr. Jerry Root. Dr. Root, along with author Mark Neo, collaborated on their best-selling book, The Surprising Imagination of C.S. Lewis. That was the theme of this podcast series. The interview with Jerry is free-ranging and covers his remarkable conversion, his serendipitous introduction to C.S. Lewis's writings and books, and the secret to his inspiration in writing of numerous books on C.S. Lewis. And now, Dr. Root. We're glad to welcome Dr. Jerry Root to our podcast today. And Jerry currently serves as the director of the Institute for Strategic Evangelism at Wheaton College Billy Graham Center, where he also teaches in the Christian Formation and Ministry Department and in the Evangelism and Leadership MA program. He's also a visiting professor at Talbot Graduate School of Theology and Biola University. He's written multiple articles, published numerous books, is probably best known, Jerry, I think, along with co-editor Wayne Martindale of the award-winning The Quotable Lewis. In fact, I've got my copy right here. I don't go anywhere without this. This and my Dopp kit when I'm traveling. And along with author Mark Neo, you've co-published two books, The Surprising Imagination of C.S. Lewis, our festival theme in 2016, and most recently, The Neglected C.S. Lewis. And I also understand you have a new book, Jerry, coming out called Dimer, A Splendor in the Dark. But this is what I love most about you. Your hobbies include everything relating to Lewis, traveling, winemaking, rich conversation, but you played football continuously until the age of 44. But here's the kicker. You love, and I mean love, virtual fear, including turbulence on airplanes, skydiving, swimming with sharks, stalls in biplanes, and has 100 times done bungee jumping equivalents. Amazing. Welcome to the C.S. Lewis Festival podcast, Jerry.
Thank you very much, David. I'm glad to be here.
Where did this insane desire for virtual fear come from?
I don't like real fear. I've been shot at before. That wasn't fun. But virtual fear, just getting the rush. Everybody likes to go to amusement parks, I think. And there's opportunities like this all around. One time I was in French Polynesia and we were feeding sharks. We were in the water with the sharks. And the Polynesian guy who I was with said, "You want to go swim outside the reef?" We went outside the reef, and a few minutes later, an 18-foot great white shark swam up. And that was not fun. That was real fear. And I remember making sure, I'm glad I had the presence of mind because I made sure the whole time the Tahitian guy was always between me and the shark.
Well, I've known you for quite a while, Jerry, and one of the other things, more importantly, that I do love about you, and I'm not the only one, is your muscular Christianity. And I've asked some of your friends and about you and what strikes them about you personally, and almost to a person, they've said the same thing. And the question for them is where does your infectious Christianity come from?
You know what, David? I remember when I became a Christian. Nobody had to tell me I was a sinner. I knew it. I knew the incongruities in my life. I believed in high ideals like love, but I had sharp words with people I cared for most. I believed in justice, but there were times when I was unfair in my treatment of others. And I also knew I longed to be loved unconditionally. And when I first heard that the God of the universe loved me and that he forgave me, and that he was willing to enter into my life and start the process of bringing order out of the chaos I had made of things, I was so overwhelmed by that. I am so grateful for that. And I have never stopped being grateful as I learn deeper and deeper applications and wider applications of that. And I think that's what drives me. I am overwhelmed by the love of God.
How are you raised?
Say it again.
How are you raised?
I grew up in South Central Los Angeles. We had a family. There were four kids and my dad and mom. We were poor, but they were hardworking, and we had to work hard too. I put myself through college and stuff like that. So I'm not convinced that being poor is a liability. I think it taught us instead, if you want something, you can get it, but you just have to work hard for it. And we were raised in a church, but I never heard the gospel there. They were good-hearted people. I loved being around them. But they taught me if I went to a movie and Jesus came back while I was in the theater, I'd go straight to hell. And I wanted to see Walt Disney's Shaggy Dog, but didn't know if that was worth risking my eternal destiny to go see. When my mom said that we could go see that film, I began to wonder if she really loved me, that she would put my life in such eternal peril. But that fear of thinking that I had to earn somehow God's love, it caused me to turn off to spiritual things. And yet I still, like Lewis writes about, had this longing for something. I knew pieces were not fit together properly. There were screws loose and so on. But I didn't think it was in God, because God was a works-oriented God, the way I'd been raised. And then it wasn't my freshman year in college. I had an older brother. He died at 48, but he had saved my life from a near drowning accident in junior high school. And he took me to this meeting when I first got to college, where I heard the message clearly that God loved me and forgave me. I have never stopped being grateful, like I said. And so I think that the upbringing that we had was good. We were taught to respect authority. We were taught to respect spiritual things, the scriptures and so on. But I never got the message straight until later.
You bring up C.S. Lewis. It's a perfect way to do the intro to him. Where and when did Lewis enter your life, Jerry?
Well, I was in college, and I was overwhelmed by the message of God's love and grace. And you have to take it by faith now, but I played football and wrestled in college. And I wanted my friends to know about him. So I would tell my friends about Jesus. And they would ask me these questions. And I'd never thought about these questions. I'm embarrassed almost to say that I never once thought about, if God's good and all powerful, why does evil exist in the universe? It intrigues me. I've written a book on it since, but I never heard the question until I was sharing the love of God with my friends. And when they asked the question, I wasn't put off by it. I said, that's a really good question. I have no clue. Let me see if I can find the answer. And as I started digging, I started finding people quoting this guy named C.S. Lewis, and the quotes were really good. I still hadn't read him. I had an older sister who was a Christian, and she was teaching fifth grade kids, and she was reading them The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And one night when I was at her house for dinner, she told me the plot of that book. And I said, you're kidding, there's books like this? I went and read the books. I read through all the Narnia books and liked them. I wanted to find out more about Lewis, found out he had an autobiography, Surprised by Joy. I read that book, and when he writes about the deep longings and his quest to find the object of his deepest longings, I knew those longings. But I never had anybody give me a vocabulary for my soul like he did in that book. Now, Lewis opens more than wardrobe doors, because if you read him, you're going to want to read the books he refers to, and you start seeing all kinds of people speak about these longings. These are not unusual things or unique things. These are things that I think plague the heart of every person who can sit contemplatively and evaluate what's going on within. But Lewis was the one who was the threshold for those kinds of thoughts for me, or at least the threshold for trying to understand how it works.
It brings to mind one of the festivals that you were the keynote speaker along with Dr. Chris Mitchell. And we had our Saturday seminar, which we do every year during the festival. It's a wonderful event, day-long seminar. And you had just stood up and had begun speaking. In fact, I don't think you had gotten beyond good morning, everyone, when this hand shot up and it was like this right in the front. And it was a person who, I don't know if she had been drugged there by her husband or her boyfriend or stumbled across it. But you asked her, yes, ma'am. And she goes, I have two questions. Who is C.S. Lewis and why should I care about him? So I ask you, who is C.S. Lewis, which you've just started to answer. Why should a viewer care about him?
Well, first off, Lewis, of course, was Irish, born and raised in Belfast, but he did most of his education in England. And his mother died when he was about 9, and his father sent him off to a boarding school in Watford, outside of London. The headmaster was tyrannical. Lewis finally gets out of there. He goes to school for a brief period of time in Belfast, and then he's sent over to Malvern, and he studies there. And then he ends up going to Lewis's father's teacher and is tutored and prepared for his Oxford University entrance exam. After that, he's shipped off to World War I. On his 19th birthday, he's a second lieutenant in the trenches of that horrible war. He is horribly wounded, comes back, finishes his Oxford degree. He's an atheist by this time. He eventually becomes a Christian, a lot due to the influence of J.R.R. Tolkien, his best friend, one of his best friends, on him. So Lewis is a guy who makes the pilgrimage. He had suffered, lost his mother, suffered in World War I, saw friends killed right next to him, and so on. He's a guy who's lived life, and he's thought about life. And consequently, he's thought deeply about it, and he finally comes to the place where he sees the answer, the thing that makes sense of all of life is a relationship with God through Christ. And he once said in one of his books that the chief problem, the first problem in life, is how do you fit the stone in the shell? The image is taken from Wordsworth's poem Prelude. There's a Bedouin shepherd walking along with a stone in one hand and a shell in the other. He's trying to fit them together. The shell represents reason. The stone represents reason. The shell represents issues of the heart, romantic longings, and so on. How do you fit them together? And Lewis can't do that. He as an atheist, as a secularist, he can't do it. And finally, he becomes a Christian. The first book he writes after he becomes a Christian, 1 year after his conversion, is The Pilgrim's Regress, an allegorical apology for Christianity, reason, and romanticism. And he saw that the Christian faith could put these things together. Anybody who's done honest thinking about life recognizes that there are certain levels of complexity. Lewis doesn't write about them as if he's got the last word and everything's been said, every T is crossed, every I is dotted, there's nothing more. But he writes about them with such authenticity, honesty, humility, that we begin to see, yes, this does make sense in life. And yes, I can go deeper in my thinking about it. And yes, I can go wider in my grasp of applications of these things. And that it begins to make sense even of the questions I haven't begun to ask, but when I ask them, I see, wow, it all sort of fits. And with Lewis, he invites us into the experience of the seamless cloth of making sense of our experience. I think that matters.
Lewis lived an imaginative life, in many ways wrote like Dante and Shakespeare. Describe to those who are watching this, that, and me included, that don't necessarily live in an imaginative state. Delve into that a little bit.
About Lewis's life of the imagination?
Yes, yes.
He actually wrote in a letter. This was a guy, Oxford University philosopher, said that he was Oxford's bonny fighter. He was their great debater. He was a person who was a brilliant logician and so on. But Lewis himself said, the imaginative man in me is older and more continuously operating than the rational man. And what he understood, I think, is that there is no growth in life without use of the imagination. Even the scientific method shows us that. It begins with a hypothesis. What's a hypothesis? It's not a reality. It's an imaginative depiction of something that might be. Now we begin to test it. And once we test it, if we discover something, we depict that with models. Those are not the thing itself, but they're imaginative depictions. You cannot grow without the use of the imagination because we're trying to explore realms where we haven't been before. What's that like? And then we begin by the lead of the imagination to discover. And I also think, too, that because of this, Lewis had this sense that there's more out there. This also grows out of his profound understanding of the omniscience, the all-knowingness of God, the greatness of God, the omnitemporality of God. Consequently, there's always going to be more, which means there's always, in this imaginative development of my life in Christ, my life in this world, There's always going to be that which will lead to deeper awe and wonder, and I think ultimately to worship. So this was real in Lewis, and I think too that's one of the reasons why his writing comes across with such vibrancy. It's alive. This is not stale stuff. This is vibrant stuff. So I think that's maybe helpful.
Well, you co-wrote a book with Mark Neal, The Surprising Imagination of C.S. Lewis. How did this book come about?
Well, Mark's been a friend for many, many years, and he had written some articles on Lewis that were very good. And we're in a discussion group on Thursday nights that meets regularly. And in my own study, I came across the fact that Lewis had 31 different ways that he wrote about the imagination, and that nobody had ever systematized these. They say that people who live in the North, they have 30 words for snow because they live 24/7 in the snow. It's dirty snow, it's powdery snow, it's icy snow, whatever. Lewis lived in the life of the imagination. He had these 31 different words for imagination. So at the fire pit one night where we were discussing, I said, Mark, you need to write a book on Lewis. I think this idea I've got for Surprising Imagination of C.S. Lewis is a good idea, but I think it's too big a project for one person. You need to write this book with me. And so we sat down and we hashed it out. We decided not to take all 31 uses of the imagination, but to take multiple numbers and show how Lewis used each one in a particular book. And then we put in the appendix the other ones. We're waiting for somebody else to come along and finish.
What surprised you most during the writing of this book about Lewis?
I think that Lewis he writes in Surprised by Joy that before he became a Christian, he liked those authors that were Christians. He shouldn't have liked them. He was an atheist. But he liked what he saw because they wrote of the roughness and density of life. They wrote of real texture. They didn't overstate things. Their demons were not all bad, and their angels were not all good. As they wrote, these Christian authors could write of the roughness and density of life. And as we studied the life of the imagination, Lewis also moves in that direction. He sees the imagination can be a positive thing, but it can also be a bad thing. He says we have this transforming imagination where we project on something what we want it to be, and consequently our encounter with that thing leaves us unchanged, and we project it on our world and spin out our sense of reality like a spider spins its web from itself. And Lewis is very opposed to the self-referential. On the other hand, the imagination can be very, very good. And he says you can have the realizing imagination. That's the medieval imagination that keeps opening up to more and more. Or the penetrating imagination, where you could keep going down deeper and deeper. He says he thought Shakespeare and Dante wrote with the penetrating imagination to understand more deeply. You've got the material imagination, Christopher Marlowe. He usually grabs these different uses from different authors that he's been attracted to over his life. But I think it's because of this wide exposure and his thinking about it and his then sort of defining categories that he could then speak with us. So that's what I found that was interesting.
Where does your inspiration come from, Jerry? And I ask this in the context of you've written extensively on Lewis, published extensively on Lewis. Your book titles, your book ideas, where is the inspiration? Where does it boil up from? And how do you know, yes, today is the day I'm going to begin writing this book on, say, Surprising Imagination?
Well, G.K. Chesterton said the world will never starve for want of wonders, only for want of wonder. And I think Lewis wrote in Experiment in Criticism, my own eyes are not enough for me. I would see what others have seen. I would read what they've written. Even that's not enough for me. I would read what they've imagined. Even that's not enough for me. I regret that the brutes cannot write books. Gladly would I see how the world presents itself to the eye of a mouse or a bee, or how it comes charged to the olfactory sense of a dog. I don't think that there will ever be a loss of things that would trigger the imagination, trigger the sense of wonder, trigger the sense of awe. The issue isn't where does it come from? The issue is how do you not explore it all? It's just we're limited by time. We only have this life. I've crammed a lot in, though. If I died today, you wouldn't have to worry. I've lived the life of about the equivalent of 10 90-year-olds. But nevertheless, there's just lots out there, and it all opens up to wonder and awe. And if we don't see it, then fall on your knees and pray, God, open my eyes that I might see. So if I see something that intrigues me, one thing that's happening more recently, the 2 books I've done with Mark recently, and also this other one I've got coming up, the one on his narrative poem he wrote before he died. I'm trying to write on things that other people aren't writing on. I think there's so much out there about Lewis, and there are things to be explored. There was a guy recently, his name was Corey Latta. He came to me and he said, I want to do a book on Lewis. I said, tell me what you want to write. And he told me, I said, Corey, those books are like belly buttons, like people's navel. Everybody's got one. Write in an area where people haven't written yet, because there's so many places unexplored in Lewis. And he said, well, what do you have in mind? I said, you should write a book on Lewis's advice on writing. He writes his letters to children. Children would send him papers they were writing for class, and he would write them back. You might consider this, you might consider that. Even in his literary criticism, he'll make a judgment about a literary work, but he's also giving good advice for people who want to learn about writing. Corey Latta wrote a great book on Lewis on writing. And I think that those kinds of things, there's lots of opportunity if people want to stretch their wings and start writing about something. They could write things about Lewis, but don't go over the worn paths. Write new stuff.
Is your interest when you're writing a book on Lewis geared more to the general public, those with some interest, those with profound interest in learning more about Lewis, or is it more academic?
I don't think it's either, really. I tried to figure out one time, why is Lewis such a good communicator and a convincing one? And I decided it wasn't because he comes at us face to face and tries to persuade us. I think instead Lewis gets shoulder to shoulder with his reader, and he describes some bit of reality out here, and he describes it so well it takes our breath away. And then he uses imaginative depiction so that we could get our minds and our hearts both around it. And so I think I've tried to pick up on that. I try to look at something. I don't think I'm thinking, am I going to reach an academic? Am I going to reach a lay person? I think I just want to describe something here. And if I could describe it well enough and that person catches it, well, that's good. But I don't know if I've done it yet. I think most of my books are bought by anesthesiologists because they found they're cheaper to prescribe than the drugs and hold people in a deeper sleep. I see every time I write, it gets a little better, but I still am waiting for the really good book. And you mentioned the quotable C.S. Lewis that we did with Wayne Martindale. That book, unfortunately, was written with scissors. We just cut and pasted Lewis, and so that's the problem. But we knew what to cut and paste, but nevertheless.
How long? I'm looking to see how many pages. It's a lot. It's 700-800 pages. How long did it take you to write this?
4 years.
Yeah.
4
Wow.
years. I was up every morning at about 4 a.m, and I worked till 8 before I went to work. So,
well, for the viewer, it's an outstanding book. This is crass advertisement here, but I have as you can tell, I have used this book countless times in talks on Lewis. It's been invaluable. It's such a gift, and the great thing about this, Jerry, is it's timeless. It's just timeless. And, you look at the volume, there are 200 societies on Lewis, countless books I think I've given up. We had the editor of Lewis's books here to the Lewis Festival in 2012. And at that time, he had mentioned that Lewis had sold up to, including the year 2012, over 50 million books.
Yeah.
Worldwide. Staggering.
Walter Hooper, right? Walter Hooper?
Well, yeah, Walter. And, it's funny you bring up Walter because I've been able to do a lot of interviews, including obviously for the festival. But there's only just a couple of individuals left on the planet that knew Lewis. And I'm curious, if you walked into a pub and there was Jack Lewis and he was sitting alone and you could get your Guinness Stout, walk over and sit down with him, what would be the first question you'd want to ask him?
Boy, I don't know. I think I would probably say, what's on your mind right now? And I would wonder, he's sitting there alone. His mind must be going. I can't imagine Lewis was sitting anywhere inert. And I would say, what's on your mind now? And I've read all of his works over and over and over again. So I could connect with that, but I want to know what would be the thing that was the dangling bits that he was trying to put together to make sense of something. It is interesting. I used to be a member of the Oxford C.S. Lewis Society. And whenever they would have a speaker, we would have dinner with that speaker. And then sometimes we'd meet with them afterwards at the Eagle and Child pub. This one night, it was John Tolkien, the oldest son of J.R.R. Tolkien. And he was in the pub waiting for people to come in. And he was by himself. It was kind of an experience like you just described. And I walked up to him and we just started talking. We had a great discussion. But I asked him some things about his dad and Lewis, because there were some people who thought that Lewis and Tolkien had a bit of a falling out at the end of their life. And I asked him about that. I said, Humphrey Carpenter had written about this in the book, The Inklings. And he said, I read that in Carpenter too. I had no idea what he was talking about. I said, why is that? He said, I was driving my father every week for the last year of Lewis's life. I was driving my father to the kiln so that Lewis and my father could be together every week. He said, I never saw any falling out. So some biographer maybe takes some letter where somebody says something a little critical of a friend, and they end up building an entire, concept out of that. And there was nothing to these things. He also said this, interestingly to me, that Mrs. Moore, who many people think was a bit of a battle axe, this woman that Lewis adopted, sort of adopted mother, the mother of his friend who was killed in World War I. So Mrs. Moore and Edith Tolkien, Tolkien's wife, they got along famously. They had a good friendship. There's again, the roughness and density of life. You could read one place about somebody being obnoxious. You hear from another person about what a delightful person they were. Who's the real person? Well, if we're honest with ourselves, we all know that both those people live in our hearts too. Maybe that's another reason why Lewis's writings are helpful to us, because they're real. They deal with these real kinds of things, and they help us put the pieces together as we read him. But anyway, so I would just ask him, what's on your mind right now?
Well, in these last few minutes, I want to circle back to a theme that we started out with, particularly as it relates to your faith and Lewis's faith. I had an opportunity to sit down with Christian author Philip Yancey, and he wrote a book called The Skeptic's Guide to Faith, and he used the term borderlands of belief. In other words, those people...
Say the term again, David.
Borderlands of belief. In other words, those people that are sort of in between. And I'm thinking of viewers that may be watching this right now that don't know Lewis or casually know Lewis, are interested in learning more. The borderlands of belief is that step forward. It's that leap of faith. What's the one book you would recommend for them if they are starting out a newbie with C.S. Lewis for them to read? What would you recommend?
Well, I would ask them questions. I would want to know where they're coming from. Are they a person who likes fiction, or are they a person who likes nonfiction? They like propositional work or imaginative work? And I would try to discern by asking them where they're coming from, and then suggest a book. But if it's just a general person and you just want a quick exposure to Lewis, and you get a flavor for his fiction, but also a flavor for some of his deep thinking, I would say The Great Divorce. It's a book you could read in an evening. It's a book that is Lewis finds himself in hell. It's kind of a satirical version of the Divine Comedy. And he ends up having George MacDonald, this author who kinds of leads him like Virgil led Dante through his experience. But he's on this bus going from hell to the threshold of heaven, and he's talking about the fights break out on the bus, all kinds of terrible things, and he's always jumbled and sitting next to somebody else. And as he's describing the conversation of this other person, we're saying, this is a despicable person, and this person's a despicable person, and this person's a despicable person. Right when Lewis gets to the threshold of heaven, the light of heaven comes into the bus, and Lewis looks down the aisle and sees his own face in the mirror. And he realizes he's one of the people. And I think there's something about this book, The Great Divorce, where as we read it, Almost unfortunately, Lewis so dissects reality that we end up seeing ourselves in the mirror of that book. And I don't think that that's all bad. I would rather know where the problems are so I could begin to work on them rather than live always trying to suppress the problems or cover them with pretense. So that book removes the pretense.
It's a great book. I would agree with you. It's probably my favorite book as well.
Right.
Followed by Narnia, and if you have children, just the magic of reading the Narnia series to a 12-year-old or a 14-year-old or a 40-year-old is really it's magical, and then obviously Mere Christianity, and Mere Christianity for me sat on my bookshelf in my home for quite a while, and then in the late 1990s I picked it up, read it, and I thought, oh my gosh, what's the film life of Lewis's life out there? What's been done? And in North America, nothing. And I was grateful to have the opportunity to produce, and then it airing for so many years on PBS. And I'll lead this into the last question, and you've touched on that as it relates to his books. He had said to Lewis, or Lewis had said to his lawyer, I think when they were putting together an estate plan, he said, well, after I'm dead for 5 years, no one will read anything that I've written. How do you explain his lasting legacy?
First off, the material's good. So maybe he undersold what he had put out. But also, I think a lot of it has to do with Walter Hooper. Because Walter Hooper started gathering up essays. He wrote some 56 books during his lifetime. There's like 73 books out there now. So he wrote all those other ones after he died. No, Hooper gathered up essays and put them under common cover and allowed them to be published. But he went to publishers and he says, I'll let you publish this book. They knew it would be a seller. Only if you come out with one or two of the books that have gone out of print and put them back in print. And so consequently, he started championing the legacy. And as a result, they don't have to worry about it anymore. All of his books are in print. So I think that because he had they say Dr. Johnson had a James Boswell. I think Hooper became the Boswell for C.S. Lewis. And that helps significantly. There's another example, too. In about 1905, Charles Dickens was a forgotten author. But G.K. Chesterton wrote a book on Charles Dickens, and Dickens' legacy has continued on because of that G.K. Chesterton book. And I think that sometimes you'll have something like that where somebody sees, remembers, and opens the door. Now, Lewis's legacy had never been forgotten, but it was starting to atrophy, and Hooper comes in and says this. I remember years ago I started teaching C.S. Lewis courses. 40 years ago, I started teaching Lewis courses. And when I first started teaching him, it was at a community college. And I would say to the students, how many of you have heard of J.R.R. Tolkien? They'd raise their hands. How many of you have heard of Lewis? Not very many. But now, everybody knows Lewis. Everybody. And it's interesting to me.
It is. And Jerry, thank you. You have been a wonderful participant in multiple C.S. Lewis festivals, I might add. And we always have almost standing room only every time you appear in Northern Michigan and Petoskey. And for that, we welcome you back at any time, hopefully it'll be in the next couple of years. But thank you, Jerry, for your time today talking about a figure that is near and dear to not only your heart, my heart, but literally countless millions of hearts as well.
Well, David, thank you for maintaining the lasting legacy of Lewis. And thank you, too, for being so generous that you have extended to me your friendship over the years. I'm grateful.
Hallelujah. Thank you. Thank you for traveling with me on the Lewis Festival Scholar Series today. To stay informed and catch the next season, please be sure to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast app. That way, the next season will automatically be downloaded. Or simply sign up for our e-news on the front page of the Lewis website, cslewisfestival.org. It doesn't get any easier than that. This entire podcast has been made possible by the C.S. Lewis Festival in Petoskey, Michigan, and its generous sponsors. To become a part of the Lewis family or to learn more about the festival and this podcast, Again, please visit our website, cslewisfestival.org.